Hello, friends on Zoom. Welcome to another fantastic Friday lecture series with a very fantastic person who I am honored to call friend and mentor, Dr. Christiane Lemke, who has been a long-time friend of the Center and TAM and UNC. And I'm going to invite our students to please come up for the introductions.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you for being here. Great. Awesome. I don't know if we can see ourselves and look great. This is what you come back.
Okay, I'll get out of the way one second. Yep. Okay. Awesome. Happy Friday, everyone. Kenzie Elton and myself had the privilege of sitting down and talking with Professor Lemke this week and learning a little bit more about her. So I'll be kicking things off. Christiane Lemke was born and raised in northern Germany. She grew up speaking both German and a Lower Saxony dialect. During her time at university, she participated in an exchange program in San Francisco. This experience was both eye-opening and foundational to her career and beliefs. While she enjoyed her time in the US, she couldn't help but notice how present political violence was during the Vietnam War. This shaped some of her foundational views on anti-violence. Dr. Lemke completed her first and second PhD at Free University in West Berlin, where she studied political science, sociology, psychology, and education science. During her time at Free, Professor Lemke gained extensive travel experience in China, Japan, Nepal, India, Thailand, and more. She returned to the US to complete a postdoc at Harvard University as a German Kennedy Fellow. Her work at Harvard focused on East Germany and communist countries.
And after her time as postdoc in the US, Dr. Lemke returned to Germany, coming full circle to the state of her birth, assumed a tenured position as a professor of IR at Leibniz University, Hanover. The role at Hanover was multifaceted, encompassing specialization in IR and into the interdisciplinary collaboration with law, economics, history, and political science. Additionally, she held the esteemed position of director for 15 years there, solidifying her status as a renowned authority in European studies. Dr. Lemke embarked on her academic journey at UNC as the first German academic exchange service professor from 1988 to 1991. During her time here, she organized our first ever conference on the crisis of socialism in collaboration with Dr. Gary Marx. Alongside her colleagues, she was foundational in the formation of the Transatlantic Master's Program, has returned frequently to Chapel Hill to teach in courses since 2004. Her dedication to bridging the gap between academia and practical politics was evident in her role as an administrator for the Parliament in Lower Saxony during 2006 and 2007. Notably, she was the first woman to hold this position. Here, she facilitated the Parliament's understanding of European institutions and legislation during a time of Christian Democrat and Free Democrat governance.
Dr. Lemke's research focuses on German politics, European affairs, and transatlantic relations. She has published widely on regime transition, migration, populism, climate change policy, and women in leadership. In addition to her research, she has a background of global engagement, including international journeys, to gain firsthand insights into pressing geopolitical issues. She visited Kosovo with a parliamentary delegation during the Kosovo refugee crisis during 2006 and 2007, assessing conditions there and contributing to the dialogue surrounding temporary residence permits for refugees who were originally expected to return after the conflict. In a similar vein, she traveled to Israel with a parliamentary delegation where she engaged with UN groups and NGOs to study the complex tensions in the region. Her commitment to academic excellence also led her to New York University, where she served as a visiting professor for 4 years, occupying the prestigious Max Weber Chair at the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies from 2010 to 2014. Her career has showcased her unwavering dedication to advancing our understanding of critical political issues and has firmly established Dr. Christiane Lemke as a leading figure in the field of political science. And with no further ado, please join us in welcoming our Professor Lemke.
Thank you very much for this very, very kind introduction, Mackenzie and Jasmine and Elton, and also to Katie, the director of the center, who is a dear friend, actually, and we worked together for several years. I'm very happy to be here to present current research. I will share some results from a research project that we conduct at Leibniz University, Hanover, together with one of my doctoral students, Jacob Wiedekind, who just actually finished his dissertation. And thanks to Jacob's skills, we produced a couple of graphs we will show. So there's some empirical material I would like to share with you. My topic, climate change, is actually something that is dear to my heart for quite some time. Growing up in Lower Saxony and teaching in Hanover, we are one of the leading universities in Hanover working on renewable technology energy and, for example, wind and not so much solar, but more wind and also sustainability issues. So when we scheduled this presentation, it was not clear. We were not aware that at the same time in New York, the United Nations would meet to talk about climate change. And it's very interesting that, these topics are now kind of addressed by a broad global audience. The topic of my talk is finding common ground in uncertain times, multilateralism in transatlantic climate change policy. And this project grew out of our interest in transatlantic relations. Jacob and I worked on the transatlantic relationship during the Trump era, and we then studied the elections 2020 in the United States. We were also following European politics closely, and we saw how important climate change is. I have a little content here, overview. I will start with our research question, what we are actually interested in our project, and I will then present some empirical findings of the perceptions about climate change and compare the US and Europe. I think I will spend a little more time on Europe because my TAM students and also my European government students here are very interested in Europe. And so I will address the right-wing populism challenge for climate change policy, and also very briefly the impact of the war in Ukraine for the discussion about energy in Europe. So the research question we started out with is global politics has addressed climate change for quite some time, actually since the early 70s. And we found that, especially in transatlantic relations, both in Europe and in the United States, it is a very important issue in the talks across the Atlantic. However, when we look at the outcomes of the most recent negotiations, for example, within the UN context, progress in controlling and curbing carbon dioxide emissions and other climate change policies that we talk about, but we don't really see the progress that is needed to stop the global warming problem. And there's a very interesting and disturbing report that came out by the UN, the Emissions Gap Report 2021. For those of you who are interested, the situation is serious, but the policies are not as strong as we would like to hope. We would like them to be. So the question is, what causes these kind of hurdles to joint policies? Here you have a graph that we compiled, and what you see here, the blue column is the European Union. These are surveys conducted by Eurobarometer and other polling agencies, global value study. And the red column is the United States. So don't get confused that these are not political parties. These are continents, right? The blue is Europe and the red is the United States. And the timeline 2007 until 2022, What we found very interesting is, I mean, the first thing that's obvious is that concern about climate change, the perception it's the most important threat, is higher in Europe than in the US throughout this time period. However, it is rising on both sides of the Atlantic. And for the US, it's interesting that concern about climate change is rising even during the Trump years, when there was a lot of rhetoric about hoax, climate change is a hoax, and so on. I don't want to go into the ups and downs here. We were quite struck by this trend that is so obvious and also shared on both sides of the Atlantic. What we also saw are very similar policies the EU enacted and the US enacted, and the timing was interesting. In 2021, the US joined the Paris Climate Accord after the election of Joe Biden. One of his first signatures was to rejoin the US Paris Climate Accord in 2021. The EU had already ratified the agreement earlier, was one of the driving forces behind creating the Paris Climate Accord, was always very proud to be kind of a forerunner or a model. But then we see that both the European Union and the US pass or establish the European Green Deal on one side of the Atlantic, and on the other side, the Biden administration is quite outspoken to curb emissions, and the Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of provisions, for example, fostering renewable energies, but also trying to kind of mitigate climate change. And so both in Europe and the US, we see also emission trading systems or other rules to curb the greenhouse gas emissions. Promotion of renewables is part of the EU policy, but also in the US as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So this coincidence, I mean, it just fascinated us that it seems so imminent that, yes, now we can move on to more effective action. But like I say, the reality is quite different. We also studied the transatlantic dialogue from an institutionalist perspective. So we have the perceptions of people, we have the policies of the governments, and we also look at institutions crossing the Atlantic, or our joint institutions of the European Union on one hand and the US on the other, talking to each other and addressing questions, not only greenhouse emissions, but also renewable energy technology, but also sustainability issues, green energy technology, and so on. So that's, I don't want to go into too much detail here. For those of you who are interested in doing internships, I mean, that's certainly something you should consider. Now, in the United States, what we see, and that's the result of our research, really, that the policy is so fragmented, and in the US, because of the federal system, and also because of partisan polarization. And partisan polarization is increasing. That's what we found in our research. We used, the Gallup database, and the question, how much do you personally worry about the quality of the environment? And the percentage of people answering a great deal. And what is so interesting here is, and I have the exact figures here, the most recent figures from Pew Research, 78% of people who identify themselves as Democrats say it is a top worry. They worry a great deal, whereas only 21% of people who say they identify as Republican say this is a very pressing issue. And you see the gap is widening. So it's really divided along party lines. And I'm sure you are familiar with this discussion. So it's an issue of political polarization, really, and a result also of political polarization that climate change policies are so politicized in the what we call the cultural wars, and that they have become really a battlefield, one should say, of the different ideologies. And we also have, we kind of looked at governments in power in the US states, and all US states actually, and the kind of climate change policies that they have established. For example, by establishing a cap for emissions and other policies that should help to mitigate the climate change, climate action plans, for example. And the column on the right is none, no climate change policy in the state. And I don't know how good you can see that here, but on the left, in the upper corner, if you have a Democratic governor, a Democratic legislature, there are a lot of policies and there are a lot of states which have very active policies in place. And having lived in New York, I know firsthand California and some others, but also North Carolina here is listed with during the time of divided government has also some policies in place. And then on the right-hand side, where it says none, no policies on climate change, all of these states are governed by Republicans, and you have a Republican legislature, Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Mississippi, and so on. So you kind of see that it's not just the people who identify as Democrats and Republicans, but also the policies in place in different US states. Yeah, so the other side of the Atlantic, we were, of course, interested in the EU situation, and a couple of points are important. The rules and regulations of the European Union apply to all 27 member states. And you're all familiar with the European Union. And at the same time, we see a lot of national variations in EU member countries. And I will go into this a little bit in a minute. Each member state of the EU has its own history, its own kind of political culture, different parties in the countries, but also different ways in how people think about climate change or the environment. What we also see is the energy mix, meaning how much fossils, how much nuclear, how much renewables you have in countries, is different from state to state. There's not one single country in the EU that has kind of the same energy mix. Some have similar kind of structures, but some rely heavily on coal, others rely heavily on nuclear, like France, and others really have promoted renewables, like Austria, let's say. So the energy mix differs. And this, of course, affects the climate change policies as well. You are probably familiar with the European Green Deal, and the president of the European Commission just recently in her State of the European Union speech emphasized again how important climate change policies are and how she stands for, reaching the goals the EU has set for itself to cut emissions by more than half by 2030. And then by 2050, we should have zero emissions, cutting all fossil energies from the energy mix and also promoting renewables at the same time. But the picture is there is, great fragmentation among European states, and this is also reflected in views on climate change in the European Union. And what we did here, again, this is based on empirical data. The Eurobarometer runs regular data. And what we did here we selected some countries, Germany, which is actually the black column here, France, the blue column, Italy, the green, Romania, yellow, and Hungary, white, because we felt we wanted to have West European and East European countries in our study. I mean, Eurobarometer takes the data from all 27 countries. But what you see is kind of up and downs, but between 2008 to 2022, the latest data we had available, there is kind of a peak in 2008 and 2009. People are concerned about climate change. This is often dependent on, negotiations in the UN realm, or the Paris Climate Accord was kind of prepared, and you have higher public awareness. And then what we found striking is that Germany stands out as one of the countries with, the highest concern about climate change as a very serious issue. You have pretty high figures in France as well. So two Western countries, but when it comes to Poland and Hungary, Romania, the concern is not as high, right? There are not as many people concerned about climate change. Italy is an interesting case. It kind of starts from a very high level. That's the green column, then goes down, goes up a little bit. In 2019, the Paris Climate Accord was already adopted in the EU, but then goes down again, despite the fact that Italy is one of the countries in Europe where you see a lot of impact of climate change with floods, with fires. It's one of the countries really suffering. And still, in just as an example, 2022, only 10% of Italians say climate change is a serious issue. And so we were kind of wondering why this is the case. And one of the keys actually is the impact of right-wing populism. But I'll come back to that in a minute. Interesting is also the answer to the question, Eurobarometer again, perceptions of responsibility to act on climate change. I mean, who is responsible? Business? Should you hold, companies responsible? National governments or the EU? These are the three categories that Eurobarometer was kind of looking at. I'll just show you here. National governments, regional, local authorities. Well, that's an outlier. Let's take this one. National governments, European Union, and you can also answer all of them, of course. Business, and we compare Germany and Poland. And what is interesting in this, in these answers here, 10 years, 2011 to 2021, in comparison, is that the Germans really think that business is responsible, the European Union is responsible, and their own government. In Poland, it's their own government first. The EU ranks fairly low as the institution being responsible to mitigate climate change. Business, kind of ranks also low in comparison. So you see here the impact of a Polish nationalist government not trusting the EU. It's not the EU that is, important for Poland, for Polish people, I should say. And business, well, can you really hold them accountable? It might slow down the economy. And whereas in Germany, you have a long tradition looking at who is causing pollution, environmental damage, emissions, trying to hold industry responsible for these problems. And this goes way back to the pollution of the River Rhine, which was addressed by the German government, not by the EU in the first place, but to hold business accountable to clean up, right? I would now like to move to the problem of right-wing populism, because what we find is that populists all over, right-wing populists, I'm leaving out the left-wing populism here, in European countries and also in the US, it takes an anti-science view, and right-wing populists usually deny that humans are responsible for pollution, for emissions, and of course for greenhouse gas problems. And so we wanted to learn more about specific positions the right-wing parties take. As you all know, political parties are in Europe kind of the most important actors in politics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Germany, the case I know best, and we also studied in a bit more detail, and then I will also talk about Sweden and Italy and the situation there. In Germany, the far-right party is the Alternative for Germany, or AfD, and I'm sure you all have heard about this party. It made inroads in the elections in 2017, around 12% on the federal level. Very surprising, very strong showing. Went down a little bit in the last elections, 2021, with 10.3%. But according to current surveys, the AfD is polling really high in several East German states where we're going to have state elections pretty soon, actually early next year. And they are stronger than any other party running, the Social Democrats or the Christian Democrats, the two major parties. So they are really kind of, showing strength. I mean, we had hoped that they would fade away after making a lot of noise, 2017, that they may actually, once they, are represented in state parliaments, and oftentimes there are a lot of infights and they don't really have a policy program, that they might fade away. But the opposite is true. It's really a party that is on the rise. And when you look at their speeches and the party program, you can clearly see that they deny the scientific data showing the climate change. And so they are really in the same boat with all the other right-wing extremists, right-wing populist parties. And one of the debates very recently was about the climate activists in Germany, and particularly the last generation the members were gluing themselves on roads and blocking traffic. It's very controversial. They immediately used the word climate terrorists, delegitimizing activities of climate activists in general, and calling for strict criminal procedures against these groups. And like I say, I mean, last generation is very controversial. We have many other climate activities going on in Germany, but if you say, they're criminals, there is kind of a potential spillover effect. And in fact, when you look at the discourse, there's some of the CDU and CSU politicians picked this up and said, these activists are criminals and they need to go to prison, and we need to ban all of these activities and so on, without really looking more closely. There are, in fact, several cases brought against some of the activists, and some of them are put on trial. And of course, the disturbance of traffic, and in particularly not letting emergency vehicles pass, which was the case in Berlin, is really something that you don't want to see in a protest action. But this language, and that's very important to us, how the right-wing party influences mainstream discourse. We've seen the same in the migration discourse earlier on. And then, of course, they call for an end to what we call in German Energiewende, meaning moving away from the fossil energies to renewable, supporting renewable energy, and particularly all of this was coined a couple of years ago as Energiewende, even before the war in Ukraine. And they think it's all, wrong, and you have to immediately call it off if they were in government. Now, interestingly enough, just recently, September 1, 2023, they published a program, pretty bold, AfD-led federal government, right? Pretending, they will be in government in a coalition, of course. However, I just have to say that they will not be in federal government. No other party will form a coalition with the AfD on the national level at this point. It's a little bit different on the state level, but even there, the mainstream parties say, we will not form a coalition with you. So I included a copy here from their program they published on the internet. It's all black, of course, it's all bleak. The situation is bad, and that's typical right-wing rhetoric is all going down the drain. So the program might as well be in dark colors, very bleak. And point one, and that's very interesting, is called Deindustrialisierung Deutschlands stoppen, meaning stop the deindustrialization of Germany. They claim that the climate change policies and energy policies of the current government leads to a deindustrialization and pushing Germany back into a crisis and making industry not competitive enough and so on. It's all bad. And there are some very specific demands I wanted to kind of highlight. They demand to cut energy prices, and we have a carbon dioxide kind of cap and price especially for industry. They want to do away with that. They also want to repair Nord Stream 1 and 2 immediately. You are probably familiar with the gas pipeline coming from Russia through the Baltic Sea to Germany, and that was immediately, project was stopped when the war in Ukraine started, and then half a year later, there was a sabotage act. We still don't know exactly who did it, and the pipeline was blown up, so it's no longer functioning. And the oil and the gas that's coming through the pipeline has already stopped, of course, is no longer. They wish to repair it. I mean, I don't know how they're going to do it, but that's their plan. Also showing their pro-Russian stand. Right-wing populist parties in Europe are usually pro-Russia, pro-Putin, and so they want to go back to the good old times where Germany had close relations with Putin's Russia. Another interesting feature that you find in the AfD program, but also in other European right-wing party programs, to reactivate and expand nuclear power plants. And you may know that Germany decided to phase out all nuclear energy in April this year, despite the problems we had in Germany, losing Russian gas and oil as our energy supply. About 50% of our energy supply was through, mainly Russian gas and oil. So there is a discussion about, shall we revive nuclear power not only in Germany, in other countries as well. And the mainstream broad consensus in the German population is no nuclear energy, as long as we don't know where you put the waste. Don't restart nuclear power plants. I know the discussion is different in the United States, but there are several European countries that phased out nuclear energy or never actually established nuclear energy. For example, a country like Austria, but also Sweden phased out nuclear energy. And so they are out there saying, no, nuclear is the solution for the future, is a clean energy. And terminate the energy turnaround. That is, of course, another important goal. Two other examples, because you're Europeanists, I wanted to briefly talk about the and we also want to have time for discussion and questions, of course. I briefly wanted to talk about the two examples of Italy and Sweden. Italy, like I say, has seen a lot of environmental problems and severe floods and storms and also fires in the past. The Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, from the Brothers of Italy, which is a right-wing party with neo-fascist roots, is an interesting person because she is now in office a bit more pro-European than she was when she was running for the elections. But she does call the European Green Deal climate fundamentalism. And she thinks, is an ideological position. And she also, in one of the speeches, I have the sources on here, she says, ecology has been, quote, militarily occupied by the left. And that's pretty strong language. And then she claims, and that's again interesting, the right really loves the environment because it loves the land, the identity, the homeland. So she's not anti-environmental policy per se, but on the contrary, she claims that the Brothers of Italy really stand for the environment. And this is kind of a very interesting European, if you study European intellectual history, this attachment to the land is very important in fascist thinking, in neo-Nazi thinking as well. And she says, that's really, you love your land, and we are the ones who are the real lovers of the environment. I thought this was a very interesting twist here. Sweden is an interesting country because it is usually seen as an example of a very progressive country, especially in environmental policy. And while they were presidents of the European Council of Ministers, they would really, pursue active climate change policies. That was one of their favorite, topics and goals. Sweden has also seen tremendous problems with fires. Country so far up north is similar to Canada, where, we had last year, the year before, huge territory in Sweden burning down from fire in the summer. I've never seen that before. It never happened before. And so it was a real wake-up call for Sweden. However, we have a strong party on the right, the Sweden Democrats, increasing in electoral support, a far-right party that is anti-immigration. That's their major kind of program. And so it was a bit hard for us to find speeches or documents where they talk about climate or the environment. It's all about, migration. But in the reports and speeches we found, we saw the Sweden Democrats deny humans' responsibility for climate change, very similar to the German AfD. Again, Sweden has phased out nuclear energy. However, the Sweden Democrats openly advocate nuclear energy and call for an extension of the nuclear power plants. And we also found that they are very much opposed to the Paris Climate Agreement, to all EU policies on climate emissions regulation. So they reject international treaties. They are very nationalistic. And the name Sweden Democrats already shows, Sweden first. right? We've heard this kind of phrase. Sweden first. I should also mention that in the last Swedish elections last year, 2022, the Sweden Democrats had significant electoral success. And because of the difficulty to form a coalition government, the current center-right government is tolerated by the Sweden Democrats. I mean, it's not part of the coalition, but they support a government policy. And in return, the government has to pick up some of the Sweden Democrats' demands. It's kind of a complex situation, but they do have an impact on government policy. So I'm not just talking about groups that kind of put pressure on governments from the outside, like the AfD in Germany on the national level, but we have here Giorgia Meloni being the prime minister, leader of government, in Sweden, where a far-right party is supporting the government, and the other way around, we should say. So what we see in Europe really is that there are brakemen for effective climate change policy. And what we don't know at this point is how influential they will be on the European level. We discussed that in our class this morning. Where do we see the impact of far-right policy on the EU? And so far, no, we cannot show that they immediately influence, let's say, emissions regulations. Excuse me. But we will see in the European elections next year how strong these right-wing groups will be, and they will certainly influence policy in the European Parliament. I also wanted to talk briefly about the war in Ukraine, because that's, of course, a big topic. Excuse me. And the German case is interesting because we used to receive more than 50% of gas from Russia. However, when the war started in 2022, imports were reduced because of the sanctions, but also because of the Russian policy in 2022, and then falling to zero when the pipeline was destroyed in the summer of 2022. Norway became the major supplier. We also get gas from other countries, including the United States, with liquid gas, and several terminals were built in northern Germany to take in the liquid gas from the US. What is also important in the German case is that there is a lot of emphasis, the current coalition government, red, green, FDP, to increase the share of renewables. So I would argue that the war in Ukraine, which is really devastating to Ukraine as a country, to the people, to the infrastructure, also to the environment. There's, by the way, a new term, environmental security, and the destruction of the environment in Ukraine due to all the, shooting weapons and so on, the ammunition, is going to be a very big topic for cleaning up after the war. In terms of energy, what is very clear is that the EU stopped dependency on Russian gas and oil. And some countries were more dependent than others. But except for Hungary, which is always the outlier case, the other EU members cut all Russian gas and oil supplies. So Russia is really kind of out there, cut off, so to speak. The other interesting development, which is more on a positive side, there's a shift to non-fossil energies in European countries. A shift to non-fossil, when I say that, Of course, nuclear is one option, not for Germany, but for countries like France and probably also Sweden and Poland and others. But it also includes renewable energies, of course, the non-fossil. So the renewables really get more subsidies, technology subsidized, and we already see a significant increase. But looking at the EU as a whole, there are very different answers and not one single strategy. Every country, due to the kind of energy mix they have, to the political culture, nuclear energy is more acceptable in France, not acceptable in other European countries. And all of this is due to history. Do you have coal in the ground or not? So there are very different answers in Europe. So the EU does not speak with one voice in terms of energy policy. And we still have these hurdles for effective climate change policy due to the fragmentation. The other result, the impact of the war in Ukraine, are rising energy prices, which is really a big concern of inflation, very much like in this country. And here again, countries in Europe answer differently to the rising energy costs. Not only saving energy is important, but there are subsidies. And then the debate is, should the subsidies go to the industry using high energy impact industries like the chemical industry, or should the money go to the people, to the population, paying more for heating and so on? So there is a political discourse right now. So when you ask Germans today, and this is the latest Statista 2023 survey, there's also some mixed feelings about climate change, we can see. Do you think the measures are going too far, they are just right, or they are not going far enough? And you basically see are going too far and not far enough. 1/3, population is split. And then you just have 22% who say, the climate change measures are just right. And this is reflecting the impact of the war in Ukraine and how prices are rising, but also how parties on the right, and by the way, I should mention that the Free Democrats also start supporting nuclear energy in Germany. So pushing from this perspective, there is some political change going on we should be aware of. It's not clear cut to say people are so concerned they will support climate change policy. So I come to my conclusion here. In our project, and I should also mention that an article will be published in the journal Transatlantic Studies very soon as an electronic version, and later on in print version. We just read the proof, so it should come out within the next couple of weeks. You are the first to hear the results here in this Friday lecture. But some of the results and the graphs you can also read up later in this article, and I'll give you the link. So we argue in our project, as a result of our studies, that beneath these broader trends in shared concerns I showed in the beginning, there are roadblocks on the national level, and they inhibit the implementation of coherent and more effective transatlantic climate change policies. So there is cooperation in transatlantic, in the transatlantic world, Europe and the United States. There is multi-level cooperation, not only on the state level, but I mentioned some of the institutions on the ministerial level, also on the level of civil society. But the major hurdles we identify, the partisan polarization in the US and the regional and national differences in the EU, will not go away. not go away easily. And the influence of right-wing populism and the growing climate change skepticism of these political parties cuts across both Europe and the United States. It's something that we share as a challenge for future policies. And my last point, the impact of the war goes well beyond cutting oil and gas. There are challenges in the realm of environmental destruction. And as you all know, Ukraine is a candidate country for the European Union. So the EU will most likely have to step up and address the environmental pollution that we already find in Ukraine, and it's even increasing. So there's a lot to do in climate change policy, both in the US, but also in Europe. And I hope that you are the generation kind of getting it done. Thank you for your attention.